This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 120 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Regular listeners will know that these days when we get to one of these round numbered episodes, we do something a little bit differently. So today, instead of having a few guests along with me, it's just me. And it is an extra special episode because it is the last episode for 2018. So this marks the third year of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. We're coming up to the third birthday in March, which is incredible. I can't believe I've been doing it this long, and it still feels like something I've just begun, and it's still fun every single time. So, thanks for listening. Especially to my lovely long-term listeners out there and to people who've recently discovered it. I've been getting some great messages lately from people who've been discovering the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, especially on Spotify. So shout out to you Spotify people. In fact, I had a really, really lovely listener contact me to say, hey, how come I can only go back 100 episodes? Why can't I go back and hear the first 18 or so? And I discovered that I could change the setting in my podcast host. And now whatever app you're on, you can go all the way back to episode 0. In fact, actually, I did listen to episode 0 and 1 the other day and I cringed a little bit, but they're not that bad. It's just different, I suppose. I didn't feel very relaxed, I don't think, when I first began podcasting. And now I can just sit here and chat like I am chatting to all my lovely friends out there. It's easier now that I know there are people like you out there listening. Anyway, today's special episode is going to be about 2018 in review. I'm going to talk about my travel fun and my podcast fun from 2018 because it was a really big year in lots of ways. But before we get to that, the sponsor of this episode is my very own travel journal school. During January, I'm running an online 3-week course. It's called No More Boring Travel Diaries. It is really fun and it will help you solve that problem of you start keeping a travel diary or a journal on your trip and then give up, or you keep one but it's laborious and when you go back to read it, it's just so tedious. Whatever kind of problem you have with a travel diary, I will solve it. So we'll be talking about all kinds of ways to improve it, talking about using the senses, looking at details but also not looking at details, thinking of story, getting rid of cliches, being funny, being emotional, all of the good stuff that can be pulled together to write a travel diary that you actually want to look at again. If you are curious, head over to traveljournalschool.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes as well. And the course No More Boring Travel Diaries should be there if you're listening ahead of the second week of January in 2019. But if you're listening at another time, I'm sure there'll be something else there to entertain you as well. Anyway, on with the show, as they say. So it's 2018 in review, and it has been a very, very big year for travel and for the podcast. But first, travel, because that's my hugest passion, of course. And I have to say that when I started this year, I didn't really know what I was going to be doing. All I had planned was a couple of weeks in Japan in March. And suddenly I ended up spending that time in Japan, heading over to Fiji with Hands on Journeys, heading to Thailand for the Australian Society of Travel Writers Convention, and more lucky than ever, heading back to Cambodia and Vietnam. Heading back with Hands on Journeys again, not to Cambodia back because it's my first time there. But anyway, heading back with Hands on Journeys to Cambodia and Vietnam because all of those experiences were incredible. So it's funny when you just don't know what a year is going to bring you. And now looking back, I had such a busy year. For someone like me who has a child in school and, needs to go to school a reasonable amount of the time. And I also run a business at home as well as my travel blog and podcast. So I do need to be here some of the time here in Perth. It was a really hectic year, but I wouldn't change any of it. No regrets. It's always better to take the opportunities that come our way, I figure. Anyway, I thought I'd have a look back at those 4 trips because it's really interesting, I find, to think back and really look at what were the highlights, not the, I saw, Kinkakuji in Osaka, or in Kyoto, highlights, but, the things that I think about nowadays having experienced those trips, because I think it takes time, a kind of mulling over in the back of your mind to really, really see what were the best parts of a trip. So first of all, going back to Japan was really special. I lived in Japan for a couple of years, teaching English, long before I had my son. Probably it's about 15 to 17 years ago now. I was living there. Started off in 2001. And being in Japan this year was very, very, very special. And the most special part was being able to show my son all those places that I'd lived and worked and shopped and ate dinner when I lived in Osaka. It was really incredible to go back there, and he indulged me beautifully. I was also genuinely interested, but not as passionate as I was about going to be able to walk those streets again and eat in my favorite little okonomiyaki restaurant in Hyotanyama where I used to teach. And it was really amazing. A little bit of almost an out of body experience to feel like I was back in the olden days when I lived there, but yet there I was with my then 7-year-old son. It was a really special feeling. And the other thing that now looking back I really appreciate about that trip to Japan was that I don't always do this or don't always find the time or whatever the excuse is, but for Japan I actually made the effort to really revise my language skills before we went. When I lived in Japan, I learnt Japanese most of the time there, and I even went on and learnt a bit more in classes when I lived in Germany and back here in Perth as well. But it's now all quite a few years ago. But in the months before we went to Japan, I used the Duolingo app to practice the Japanese that I'd learnt. And it really, really helped. Was a, good way to refresh that knowledge and to have, that practical, tourist kind of lingo, trains and eating and all of that stuff. And I loved being able to put that into practice. So it's something I want to remember and, remind myself that it's worth making the effort. I mean, when I was using the Duolingo app, it was maybe 10 minutes a day. Anyone can find 10 minutes a day, and it really made a big, big difference. So I really appreciated that. So my next trip after Japan was Fiji, and that was a very out of the blue kind of situation. I met Simla, who runs Hands-On Journeys, and she said, you can come on this trip to Fiji. And it was like less than 2 weeks, I think, or just over 2 weeks until we would go. So I'm not really a good spontaneous traveler. It was it was a shock to the system for me. I'd also never really thought much about Fiji or in fact any of the Pacific Island countries, because here in Western Australia, they seem pretty far away and they're relatively expensive to get to compared to Southeast Asia. So we don't really give them too much thought. However, it was amazing and I would love to return and to explore the rest of that region as well. But looking back, the most significant part about it was just a completely new approach to travel, because it was my first experience of taking my son on a group trip. I mean, to be honest, it's the first time that I've been on a proper group trip. I've been on press trips or media trips before with a group, but never on a normal group trip, so to speak. And I was just blown away by how much I love that part of it. I think that the kind of travelers who choose a company like Hands-On Journeys, who do small trips, small groups, and they focus on the empowerment tourism stuff, I think that lends itself to having amazing people there. But it was just amazing because we still have really wonderful friends that we made on that trip. And it was brilliant for me as a single mother traveling with my son to have these other adults around who actually really enjoyed spending time with him as well. And I will never forget things like Jessie taking off with my son to circumnavigate the little island in Fiji on a stand-up paddleboard, or to Lucas for distracting him when he was tired or upset or cranky with drawing or talk of soccer or all kinds of stuff. Oh, I remember them looking at the stars together. I mean, all sorts of beautiful moments. So yeah, that was a really new approach and we loved it. And it was just a great collaboration to work with Hands on Journeys, because I really appreciate the approach that they take to travel. Now, after Fiji, I ended up in Thailand, and this was the only trip this year without my son. And as much as I, of course, utterly adore traveling with him, sometimes it's also nice to feel like I'm back in my old kind of independent travel days. It really felt like time travel to be exploring a country that I didn't know much about, and to not have a child there, as much as it's also, there's so many benefits to having him there, but it's different. And I feel so, I don't know, so free again. Parents will understand what I mean, but I wouldn't swap it for anything. But it's just nice to have that feeling sometimes. And of course, I was also there for a conference, and I was speaking about blogging to a room full of mostly or quote unquote traditional travel writers, so people who write for magazines and newspapers. And then I got to travel with some of them to northern Thailand. And it was really different to usual, because I usually end up meeting lots of bloggers or podcasters. And I learned a lot from these travel writers, things like especially their attention to detail. That was something that I think a lot of us bloggers lack. But I also learnt that I'm glad I'm a blogger and a podcaster, and I can say what I want when I want. I'm not bound to an editor or a deadline. And I really love that freedom of communication, I suppose. So, this is my platform, and I can say I can give the opinions I want to give. And with those opinions, I can find, and other discussion, I can find a group of people who are like-minded or are happy to, have a constructive discussion about these things. And that's what I think this podcast and the Thoughtful Travellers group on Facebook does. And I'm really grateful for that. So I learnt lots from Thailand again. And our last trip this year was, I guess it was the best trip we've had in a long time, even though having just spoken about Japan, I find that hard to say. But the wonderful Simla from Hands on Journeys took us to Cambodia and Vietnam for about a week in each country. And it was obviously then 2 weeks of group travel with my son, who was then 8. And I was worried about how he would go with that. And, we didn't always, it's a fairly packed itinerary. We didn't do every single thing on the itinerary. But it was well worth going. Some of the friends we met in Fiji came on the trip with us, so that was a real bonus. And a really special trip in so many ways. It taught both my son and I so much, and has many lasting memories. A simple one today. So today I spent the day at the Perth Zoo with my son and his class and some other classes from his school. There were several bus loads, but I was in charge of just my son and 3 of his classmates. And we spent a little time at the wombat section. Wombats are my favourite Aussie animals. And we could see the wombat burrows. So they had a sort of a cross-section part where we could see into their burrows. And my son started telling his friends that it looked like the Cu Chi tunnels in Vietnam that were part of, built during the Vietnam War, and where he crawled through them with our friend Lucas while we were in Ho Chi Minh City and visiting the Cu Chi tunnels. And he was explaining it all to his friends, who were fascinated by this whole thing of all these tunnels being underground. And he explained it beautifully. And I thought, wow, that's quite a few months ago that we were there, but he remembers all of that perfectly. And now 3 more of his mates know a bit more of the history of this. And I thought that was a really lovely moment. And further proof that my son still thinks daily about Cambodia and Vietnam is that he still has his watch set to the Cambodian and Vietnamese time zone and refuses to change it back to Perth time, because I think he still really wishes he was there. And I think I might have said that on the podcast before, but still more months or more weeks later, it's still the same. Anyway, now I do realize when I speak about these trips that what a privileged life I lead. I've been so fortunate this year to be able to travel as much as I have. But apart from feeling, extraordinarily lucky, I also hope that through this podcast, I'm able to pass on some of the wisdom that I learned from the trips, and as well as inspiring you to get out and travel whenever you can yourself as well, to make travel a priority, I guess, as much as you can, because it is so life-changing. But I do acknowledge this enormous privilege that I have, and feel very blessed about that. So that was my travel fun for the year. Now onto some podcast fun. As I said, we're nearing the third birthday of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, and this year was awesome. The numbers of listeners has continued to grow, and I just adore our Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, and I really just love everyone who's involved there. Let me give a special shout out to some of you who've been chatting to me there regularly for years now, I suppose. People like Kati, Eva, Amy, Nerea, Leslie, and a bunch more. And I know we have group members now from more than 25 different countries, which is cool. There's people in South Korea to Spain, from Uruguay to Canada, from Cuba to Cambodia, and heaps of other places. And I just think that's awesome. And I also, especially lately, have had a lot more messages from brand new listeners, and they make my day every time I get one like this. So, for example, this week, or very recently, I had a message from Lily, and she said she recently discovered the podcast, is currently doing quite a monotonous job, and the podcast helps her get through the day, which is awesome. And she's apparently an Aussie who's been in London for 15 years. And so she loves hearing my beautiful Aussie accent because it reminds her of home. I'm not sure my Aussie accent is beautiful, but it is Aussie. I know this. Although I like to think I'm less Aussie than some Aussies. Except then I listen back to myself and think, oh my goodness, you are so Australian, Amanda. What's that all about? I've had another couple of messages from brand new listeners recently, which really touched me because it seems that the podcast helps them, and that's amazing to me. So I had one from Georgia who said she'd recently discovered this podcast on Spotify, and she was messaging or posting in the Thoughtful Travellers group just as she was sitting on a plane heading from London to Hanoi, Vietnam. She had a one-way ticket off to teach English, and she said that while she was preparing for the trip, the podcasts have really helped her and even inspired her to set up her own blog. So I look forward to reading that as well. But I'm really glad that a podcast like mine, a humble thing, can help out a little bit. So, I think there was one more message from Kitty, and she said she'd found it recently on Spotify. As I said, lots of Spotify people lately. And she said, as I'm coming to the end of my year in Sydney, it's helped me in getting my head around going home to the UK and looking to plan my next adventure. Thank you so much, and can't wait to listen to more and more. I think going home from some time abroad especially extended time abroad, is so hard. So I hope, Kitty, you don't experience too much reverse culture shock, but planning your next adventure is always a good idea. That's something I like to do too. And speaking of next adventures, there was a question in the group today about what will I be up to in 2019. Well, if you think back to the beginning of this episode, when I hit 2018, I didn't have much planned, and then so much happened. And I think it's going to be a little bit like that for 2019. I do, however, have one awesome trip planned. Well, not really planned, but the flights are booked, and that's pretty much the most important part for me. So we will actually be going to Thailand via Copenhagen. Now, it's not really via, is it? Because I live in Western Australia, and I don't think that Copenhagen is actually on the way to Thailand. But let me explain. So my son and I are headed to Thailand for the wedding of his much older cousin. Obviously, my son's only 8. His cousin is considerably older, and he's getting married in Thailand next year. And you know me, I love to look for a great airfare deal. I was very studiously reading the daily emails from I Know the Pilot. That's my Aussie version of good flight tips. And suddenly this great deal came up where we could fly to Thailand, stay a week for the wedding, and then continue on to Copenhagen in Denmark, and then come home for nearly not much more than it would have cost us just to go to Thailand. So of course I said to my son, should we book this? And he of course said, of course you should, quick, do it. And I asked a few other enabling kind of people and they all said, yes, go and book the flights. So we did. It was just one of those weird coincidences. I had a fairly passionate interest, or still do, in Denmark, but I'd been binge watching some Danish TV series on Netflix and on our SBS broadcaster here. So I was just really thinking about Danish. I'd even already downloaded the Duolingo app to learn Danish, not to really learn it, but just to learn more about the language because I'd picked up so much from watching these shows. And then these flights came up. And of course, anyone who knows anything about my son will know that he's very excited about the idea of being in Denmark because Denmark is the home of Lego and we will be able to travel to Billund, the little town where Lego began, and they have a Lego land and a Lego house, and we will have a lot of fun there. And I'm really pleased I can take him there while he's still young enough to really enjoy those kind of things because he will be 9 when we go. He'll be Mr. 9 instead of Mr. 8. Now, where else will I go in 2019? Probably for some work in Bali, probably for a conference in Melbourne, potentially to Africa on a group trip. I'm not really sure. This is my kind of balls in the air at the moment, but as 2018 proved, anything could happen. So I'm just open to figuring it out. Now, this year we were particularly lucky because Mr. 8, my son's teacher, was super supportive of him traveling. In fact, she almost pushed me to take the extra trip to Cambodia and Vietnam. And I definitely wouldn't have done that if she hadn't been more than enthusiastic about it. So we have to wait and see. With the new school year coming up in February in Australia, will my son's teacher still be supportive? We're lucky here we don't get fined for taking them out of school the way that some of my English friends have been. But at the same time, I don't want to rock the boat too much. So we'll see. Really, when I say this to kind of placate myself, but when push comes to shove, I will just take him out of school and go traveling because I think it's more valuable than anything that can happen at school while he's still young. But anyway, we'll wait and see what happens. Who knows what 2019 will really bring. But I would love to hear your plans for 2019. Hop over to the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group and tell me there because I would love to hear about them. Always love a good bit of vicarious travel. The more the merrier, I say. Anyway, that about brings us to the end of episode 120. There's going to be a few weeks of the Christmas and New Year break with no new podcasts. I'm sorry, but I know we're all busy at this time of year anyway. I will be back in early January with lots of thoughtful travel. And of course, in early January, the Travel Journal School course, No More Boring Travel Diaries, starts as well. So don't forget, you can look that up at traveljournalschool.com. And other than that, in the show notes, there'll be that link and a link to the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. And that's about all this time. So thank you so much for all your lovely support and discussions and messages and downloads and all of that stuff during 2018. Look, honestly, if you have enjoyed listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, even just 10% as much as I've enjoyed making it, then I think you must be very happy because it's one of the very, very most fun things I do. I love every part about making the podcast and I will continue to do so for as long as humanly possible, I reckon, because it's something that just has so much fun. I've already got lots of interviews stocked up and stored ready for 2019 episodes, a bunch of interesting people ready to be interviewed, and just lots and lots of new ideas. Oh, and you heard it here first. I am planning, let's say definitely, I think, to launch a companion podcast for kids. So the title's not quite decided yet. There's all sorts of ideas in the works. I have a working title, but it's a secret for now. But I am planning to launch a kids podcast about travel, culture, and geography. And I'm hoping to launch that on March probably March 25th or around about then, to coincide with the third birthday of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. So that is something else to keep me busy in 2019, just in case life isn't busy enough as it is. So that is it for 2018. Thank you so much for all your fabulous contributions. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year if you celebrate. And I look forward to talking with you all again, heaps more about all sorts of cool, thoughtful travel topics in 2019. Thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.